Here's something else I got a problem with. The 10 Commandments. Here's my problem. Why are there 10? You don't need 10. I think the list of commandments was deliberately and artificially inflated to get it up to 10. It's a padded list. Here's what they did. About 5,000 years ago, a bunch of religious and political hustlers got together to try to figure out how to control people, how to keep them in line. They knew people were basically stupid and would believe anything they were told, so they announced that God had given them some commandments. Up on a mountain, when no one was around, God had given them the 10 Commandments. But let me ask you this. When they were sitting around making this shit up, why did they pick 10? Why 10? Why not 9 or 11? I'll tell you why. Because 10 sounds official. 10 sounds important. They knew if it was 11, people wouldn't take it seriously. Say, what, are you kidding me? The 11 Commandments? Get the fuck out of here. But 10 sounds important. 10 is the basis for the decimal system. It's a decade. It's a psychologically satisfying number. The top 10, the 10 most wanted, the 10 best dressed. So having 10 commandments was really a marketing decision. And to me, it's clearly a bullshit list. It's a political document artificially inflated to sell better. I'm going to show you how you could reduce the number of commandments and come up with a list that's a little more workable and logical. We're going to start with the first 3, and I'll use the Roman Catholic version because those are the ones I was taught as a little boy. I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not have strange gods before me. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Thou shalt keep holy the Sabbath. Right off the bat, the first 3, pure bullshit. Sabbath day, Lord's name, strange gods. Spooky language. Spooky language. Designed to scare and control primitive people. In no way does superstitious nonsense like this apply to the lives of intelligent, civilized humans in the 21st century. You throw out the first 3 commandments, you're down to 7. Next, honor thy father and mother. Obedience, respect for authority. Just another name for controlling people. The truth is, obedience and respect should not be automatic. They should be earned. They should be based on the parent's performance. Parent's performance. All right? Some parents deserve respect. Most of them don't. Period. You're down to 6. Now, in the interest of logic, something religion is very uncomfortable with, we're going to jump around the list a little bit. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness. Stealing and lying. Well, actually, these two both prohibit the same kind of behavior. Dishonesty, stealing, and lying. So you don't need 2 of them. Instead, you combine them and you call it thou shalt not be dishonest. And suddenly, you're down to 5. And as long as we're combining, I have 2 others that belong together. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Once again, these 2 prohibit the same kind of behavior. In this case, marital infidelity. The difference is coveting takes place in the mind, and I don't think you should outlaw fantasizing about someone else's wife. Otherwise, what's a guy going to think about when he's waxing his carrot? But marital fidelity is a good idea, so we're going to keep the idea and call this one, thou shalt not be unfaithful. And suddenly, we're down to 4. But when you think about it, honesty and fidelity are really part of the same overall value. So in truth, you could combine the 2 honesty commandments with the 2 fidelity commandments and give them simpler language, positive language instead of negative, and call the whole thing, thou shalt always be honest and faithful, and we're down to 3. Thou shalt, they're going away fast. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. This one is just plain fucking stupid. Coveting your neighbor's goods is what keeps the economy going. Am I right? Your neighbor gets a vibrator that plays "O Come All Ye Faithful." You want to get one too. Coveting creates jobs. Leave it alone. You throw out coveting and you're down to 2 now, the big honesty and fidelity commandment, and the one we haven't talked about yet, thou shalt not kill, murder, the 5th commandment. But when you think about it, When you think about it, religion has never really had a big problem with murder. Not really. More people have been killed in the name of God than for any other reason. All you have to do... Sure. Yeah. All you have to do is look at Northern Ireland, the Middle East, Kashmir, the Inquisition, the Crusades, and the World Trade Center to see how seriously the religious folks take thou shalt not kill. The more devout they are, the more they see murder as being negotiable. It's negotiable, you know? It depends. It depends. It depends on who's doing the killing and who's getting killed. So, with all of this in mind, I leave you with my revised list of the 2 commandments. Thou shalt always be honest and faithful to the provider of thy nookie. And thou shalt try real hard not to kill anyone, unless, of course, they pray to a different invisible man from the one you pray to. 2 is all you need. Moses could have carried him down the hill in his fucking pocket. And if they had a list like that, I wouldn't mind those folks in Alabama putting it up on the courthouse wall. As long as they included one additional commandment, thou shalt keep thy religion to thyself. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Well, that was George Carlin, his take on the 10 Commandments. We'll get back to that in just a couple minutes, but welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College here in New York. It would be hard to disagree, whatever one's political party, allegiance, or ideology, that Wall Street, large corporations, the world of high finance, and its culture of profits above all else, the materialism, the consumerism, greed and worship of big money, the power elite, the prison military-industrial complex, if you will, dramatically controls and profoundly influences all Americans at all levels of our daily existence. Whether it's corporate control of the political system, the economic system, higher education, the criminal justice system, the media, religion, the military, the food supply, medical system, etc. What we eat, what we think, what we see, how we die, what we read, how we conduct wars, what we listen to, how we fight, how we control people, how we relate to each other, are increasingly products of a corporatization of America of unparalleled, unprecedented historical proportions. Even Calvin Coolidge, who made the statement in the 1920s that the business of America is business, would be shocked and perhaps even embarrassed at the country's obscene, conspicuous consumption today. These excesses exist alongside record levels of homelessness, poverty, and vicious structural violence associated with poverty and racism that propel America to be the most violent, developed, industrial country in the world, by far. As Cornel West has put it, the most frightening feature of the civic melancholia in present-day America is the relative collapse of integrity, honesty, and decency, an undeniable spiritual blackout of grand proportions. In short, the rule of big money and its attendant culture of cupidity and mendacity have led to our grand moment of spiritual blackout. Today on the Radical Imagination, we are thrilled to have Reverend Anna Livy Lyons on the show to discuss her just published book, No Other Gods, The Politics of the Ten Commandments. In the book, she tries to show how the Ten Commandments are not about antiquated moral restrictions, as George Carlin so artistically described it, but a code that has vital contemporary relevance that can bring us meaning, illuminate our values, resist injustice, heal our earth, find personal dignity, and help us navigate through the turbulent waters of social injustice, environmental crisis, and societal inequality. So, George, wherever you may be, take a listen. We don't have to invent a bunch of new practices for a meaningful way to live out our spirituality and social justice politics. We have something that has existed for some 3,000 years that will give us as much progressive firepower as any of us can handle. Anna is a writer and preacher, serving as senior minister of First Unitarian Congregational Society in Brooklyn. Her work revolves around building a religious counterculture, a multi-faith movement that redeploys traditional religious practices to address the urgent needs of our time. Her sermons and articles are published in Quest for Meaning, Criterion, UU World, and Tikkun magazine, where she's a contributing editor. So Anna, it's great to have you here. Welcome to the Radical Imagination.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
And
what
want
a
to
great
discuss.
Introduction.
Oh, it was meant from the deepest of our radical imaginations, because this is the book, No Other Gods, the Politics of the Ten Commandments. And imagine George Carlin hovering above us, or
He's with us.
He's with us, isn't he?
Today,
And
yeah.
What would you say to his characterization?
Oh, he gives such a perfect crystallization of the sort of liberal, the critique of the Ten Commandments from the left.
Okay.
Right? This idea that
The
we don't need
more
them.
secular left?
The secular left, yeah.
Or he was brought up as a Catholic, so it's a sort of rejection of
Yeah, well,
the
I think
traditional.
even religious liberalism tends to say, we don't need them anymore, right?
Okay.
That's kind of old news, and he did this whole
Right.
gimmick of like, how can we get them down to 2 or none at all, right?
We don't need to
And
be commanded.
yeah. Well, we
That's-
certainly don't need to be commanded, according to the left, right? That's
Okay.
a huge theme of my book.
Mhm.
But his sense that these are sort of obvious ethical guidelines, that seems to be the prevailing view on the left, right? We don't need them. And a little bit of a sort of darker twist that he gave to it when he said that this is, I think he said, a way of controlling
Yeah.
scared and primitive people, right? So they're really
Marketing people.
Yeah, marketing and sort of manipulating
Right.
people, right? So he sort of represents that view of the left, and in a comical way of dismissing them. We don't need them, right? Then you have the critique on the right, not the critique, but then you have the view of the Ten Commandments on the right. People like Roy Moore and Lynn Westmoreland, right, who'd like to have them in all the courthouses in the country and on our schools.
Even though, as
and-
you put it in the book, he can't recite the Ten Commandments if you ask him.
Yes.
So
yes,
that's
so
maybe
right,
he
Lynn
thinks it's so obvious
Westmoreland.
he doesn't need to memorize them or.
Right. So Lynn Westmoreland, I tell the story in the book. He
Yeah.
goes on the Colbert Report, right, to be
Right.
interviewed. Why he agrees to be interviewed by Stephen Colbert, I don't know. But at some point in the
Sell his
interview,
book, maybe.
yeah. But at some point in the interview, Stephen Colbert says, "What are the Ten Commandments?" And he couldn't name them because it's not about the content. It's not about the content of what the commandments actually are, I think, to these people who claim them on the religious right. It's about a cultural identity. It's about what they represent. It's about establishing Christianity as our sort of national religion in some way. So they are used to represent something, but there's very little investment in what the actual content of the commandments
And following
are.
through on what these commandments are all about.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So it's paying lip service, or to what? Justify your own
Well, to
privileged
justify,
position?
in that case, I think to justify a kind of social conservative agenda.
Which is rooted in what?
It's rooted in sort of contemporary evangelical interpretations of the Bible. The Ten
Okay.
Commandments has come to be a symbol of that, right, of the social conservatism. And if you were to press somebody who is a little bit more theologically astute than Lynn Westmoreland, they might say, for example, that the commandment against adultery basically outlaws gay sex. Right.
Right.
The
Yeah, I see where you're going with this,
commandment
yeah.
against killing outlaws abortion.
Right.
Right. So,
But
so
not
these
the death penalty.
No,
No,
not the death
that's-
penalty. Right. So these, yeah, but that's a good point.
Or
These,
wars,
the
for that
commandments are used by people on all sides. They're kind of a Rorschach test, right? They're used on all sides as leverage for a particular political agenda.
Yeah.
And that because they're powerful, because they have a kind of cultural resonance.
Right.
They mean something to people, and so everybody wants to kind of use them to further their agendas.
And we're going to listen to Reverend William Barber here in just a couple of minutes.
Great.
And we're so polarized by the culture wars that perhaps at the center revolve around these 10 commandments and what people resonate about them. So if we can, let's take a short clip now and look at Reverend William Barber talk about faith and morality in America today.
Great.
Address the issue of extreme militarism. We are very clear that the time has come to challenge the limited view of morality often put forth by the so-called religious right or the so-called conservative evangelicalism. As pastors and trained theologians, we understand that any notion of evangelical to be biblically consistent must begin with a critique of systems that create poverty, injustice, inequality, and declares that certain people are less than other people. Somebody must stand up and say, it doesn't matter which party is in power, who has a political supermajority once elections are over. There are some things that transcend political majorities and mere majority politics and the narrow categories of liberal versus conservative and Democrat versus Republican. There are some things that must be challenged because they're wrong, they're extreme, and they're immoral. But before elections are over, people of faith, people who have a deep moral conscience must be engaged. We cannot simply judge candidates by whether they had a photo op here or photo op there. We must look at policy, and how that policy lines up. When we look at, for instance, in the Jewish text, Isaiah chapter 10 says, woe unto those who legislate oppression and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. Or we go, for instance, to the New Testament, Jesus' first sermon, first evangelical sermon, where he laid out the kinds of concerns we ought to have in the public square. He talked about the poor, the sick, the blind, the broken, the hurting, and everybody who's been made to feel different, made to feel strangers. He said we must declare the acceptable year of the Lord. And in the closing of Jesus' life, he said nations would be judged by how we treat the least of these, the poor, the hungry, the thirst, those in prison. And so we believe we must expand, we must redefine morality in the public square. We can no longer just accept when we talk about moral issues, the conversation is simply about prayer in the school, where you stand on abortion, where you stand on homosexuality, where you stand on the Second Amendment, and where you stand on property rights and tax cuts. We believe from our deepest religious values and our deepest constitutional values, because even our Constitution does not begin with the things I just listed. Our Constitution says that our deepest moral principles, first of all, is an understanding of we, not simply about I and mine. And then secondly, the establishment of justice, the providing for the common good, the promoting of the general welfare, and the insurance of domestic tranquility. Those are the great moral tenets of our Constitution, and faith and justice and love and mercy and equality are the great moral.
Wow.
It's beautiful.
A lot there,
it's
yeah.
It's beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, the we rather than the I, and
Absolutely.
the communal nature of our existence. And
yeah. I love
Yeah.
how he talks here and in a lot of his writing about how the real moral religious issues of our day are not those sort of individual morality issues of abortion and homosexuality and whether you pray in school or not, but they're the big social systemic questions of poverty and the destruction of our environment. I wish he talked more about that. those are the way that evil is really being perpetuated in our world today is through systems, and the systems in which we participate, and we have the opportunity to resist those systems. To me, a contemporary reading of the Ten Commandments calls us to think systemically about our world. That the commandment to not steal means something very different in a sort of global economy, right? Where people on the other side of the world are working in sweatshops to make your running shoes, right? And you can pay the listed price for those running shoes, but you've still stolen. You've stolen from the people who didn't get a living wage or who were working in a factory that collapsed, right? You've stolen from the common good of the environmental resources that we have. Actually, I hate the word resources. The elements of the natural world that exist, and the clean water and the clean air that were damaged by the production of those shoes. So theft takes on a very different meaning in a global economy, and I think when we look at the Ten Commandments, we need to broaden our understanding to think
just
in
as
those,
Barbara
in those
is saying.
terms. Yeah.
Yeah, and which is what you do in the book here.
Yeah.
You look at each 10.
Yeah.
So it's again going back to a propositions of living and commandments, if you will, that is eternal in a sense and transcendental, that is as relevant today. And the reason we don't see the connections, the links, is what? The corporatization of our world, the spiritual blackout that Cornel West talks about, and so many others now.
I think it's because we don't see it because the gods that we have now are invisible.
Okay.
We still worship gods in our secular world. But those gods are invisible to us because we like to think that we live in the world of freedom, right? We have unlimited choice.
Choice to
right?
buy this or that car and this or that athletic shoe that we get where people halfway around the world are getting 10 cents an hour to produce.
But we're looking to other things for salvation now, right? We're looking for products. We're looking to products for salvation. We're looking to the internet and the number of Facebook likes that we get when we post something. We're looking to the approval of others. We're looking at our social status. Right? These are all the things that we believe will make us happy, that we believe will save us, and that we're willing to sacrifice for. Right? We have these other gods in our world.
The god of greed and money and consumerism,
power.
But it's not made into that evil. It's again, like you say, we have such wonderful freedom of choice.
Yeah.
And don't we, to play devil's advocate here?
Yeah.
I mean, we have these wonderful advantages. We have planes and all kinds of things we can travel on, get us places, and we can buy this or that, and feel that we are. More comfortable, we have more luxury, or I should say more time on our hands perhaps, as a result of maybe automation, and isn't technology a help in our liberation? Or can it be? Well,
two things. First of all, who is the we that we're thinking of when we think about all the advantages of the modern world, right? That's definitely...
That's political. Now you're getting very political.
Yeah,
who do we mean by
absolutely.
we?
Who's the we? I mean, there are some subset of us, we, who've really benefited from these advances, and then there's a large majority of the Earth's population still living in poverty. That's thing one. Thing two is that this has all come at the expense of the natural world and our ecosystems. And so all of the benefits that we're getting all come from somewhere. The airplanes and the oil and all that stuff is at some point back in its history was extracted from the earth. And we extract and we extract and we extract and we steal from the earth in a way that is not even close to sustainable. The production, the extraction, the consumption never stops. And so what we're ending up with is an impoverished planetary system that's literally unsustainable, and we're seeing now with climate change as sort of the most sort of obvious and drastic impact of the consumer economy, that we're creating a situation where humans won't be able to exist on this earth anymore.
And we're still never satisfied. We're never at peace. It's an insatiability. We never have enough.
That's right.
And
That's right.
And so what does the commandments, what can the commandments offer us here in this world that has become so bleakly blacked out,
Yeah.
if you will,
Yeah.
blind to the other? How do
The
we
commandments and
how do you
religious
attempt to tackle it?
Yeah,
that question
the commandments
in the
and
book?
religious tradition in general, I think, offer us a God that we actually intentionally have as our God. And what I mean by that, the God that is introduced in the beginning of the Ten Commandments, right? There's this the setting. I'll give the setting of this. The Israelites have left Egypt in the story. They've escaped from slavery in Egypt through the parting of the Red Sea. They've wandered for 3 months eating the manna that God has provided for them. And then they're going to have this great revelation. So they're at the base of Mount Sinai. They are told to not have sex for 3 days and not touch the mountain, or else you're going to die if you touch the mountain. It's all very dramatic. They're getting set up for this huge revelation. And then God speaks directly to the people, first time ever, addressing the entire community, and God defines what God is as the very beginning of the Ten Commandments. And God says, I am, and the English sort of transliteration would be YHVH, your God. The YHVH in Hebrew, Yud He Vav He, is the Hebrew verb to be. It's being itself, reality itself.
God is being.
God is being. God is existence and reality. So it's not some
It's life.
dude. It's not some dude with a beard in the
Right.
clouds, right? As
Right.
George Carlin would probably picture.
As he learned it,
Right.
perhaps,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Right. So that's part one.
and he
of
righteously is speaking against that sort. So you two would
Yeah.
really connect on that one.
Oh yeah, we agree on a lot.
Absolutely.
We agree on a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Zalman Schachter Shalomi, the founder of the Jewish Renewal Movement, once said that the God that you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. Right. So I think
great way of putting it.
I could say that to George Carlin too. Right. So this is God introducing God's self as being. And if God had stopped right there, then it would have been a very Buddhist thing. Right? God is just existence. God is just reality.
Okay.
Right? But God doesn't stop there. God defines itself further, saying, I'm the force that brought you out of the land of Egypt from a house of slaves.
So that
So
right away gets us
suddenly-
into the political
Yes.
rebellion.
Yes. So suddenly this God is political and has a vested interest in human affairs and is actually taking sides.
Has entered into history in a sense.
Yes.
Or the
Right,
history of
has
the Jewish people.
Intervened in human
Israelites.
history on
Okay.
behalf of an oppressed people against their oppressors.
Which
right.
then gets universalized or to mean oppressed people all over, or should mean that.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. So this is.
But
this
that's
is-
not okay. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but that
No.
doesn't follow through. The story is that, again, as we've seen, a lot of people, right-wing evangelicals, and Barbara considers herself an evangelical preacher. But
Yeah.
anyway, why don't they get it that? Or I don't want to sound too pompous here. I mean, but
Yeah.
yeah, why don't they get it? Why
I-
can't they make that connection? Or what happened
I
in the
can't.
translation? Or
I can't answer that except that I think that over the years, every sort of revolutionary religious movement has gotten co-opted by the forces of power.
and let's also
and consumerism to use to their
Right.
advantage. Yeah.
and wasn't that all the ancient Israelites were flocking to this either, right? I mean, many didn't accept,
Yeah.
or did they?
Oh well,
Or
no sooner
commandments.
did
Right.
God stop speaking
Yeah.
from the top of the mountain,
Right.
then the golden calf incident happened.
So the
right?
Jewish George Carlin.
They
started
immediately Moses was on his
Yeah,
sabbatical
yeah.
up the mountain, and they were like, I don't even remember who this guy was or who this God was, and they say to Aaron, make us a god. And they take their gold jewelry, which was gold that they had gotten from Egypt, from the place of their enslavement, and they turn that gold into a god that they worship. This is not subtle symbolism, right? They are worshiping their own status symbols, material possessions, which was their link to the place where they were enslaved. They were revisiting their physical slavery through a kind of spiritual slavery.
So that means, and this is a big part of your book, right? A counter movement is necessary.
Yes.
A countercultural, spiritual experience, religious understanding needs to be brought into this co-optation.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Oh, absolutely.
Did I get it? That's yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that we need to reclaim an understanding not just of the Ten Commandments, but of our religious traditions in general. Religious traditions, of course, have elements to them that are oppressive, right? And that's what the left has reacted against all of these years. There is awful stuff in the Bible.
In the name of God, as Carlin points out.
In the name of God.
Still going
which
on.
Which is a violation of the third commandment, but
Right.
we can get to
Okay.
that in a minute. And so liberals have understandably reacted against violence and oppression that's in the biblical text itself. The Bible was written by human beings, I believe. Most people, most scholars believe, certainly, written by human beings. And so it contains the sort of oppressive mindsets of their cultures from which they were writing and the times in which they were writing. I believe that it also includes genuine revelation. It also includes language, text, images, stories that are truly resources for transformation. And I think part of our job as modern people is to kind of sift through and sort of find like what is the true voice of transformation and love in these texts, and what's an artifact of a prior time and place.
And one of the first mentions of that is, right, the love of the other. Isn't that central?
Absolutely.
And yet we
love of the
are
other.
operating structurally to do the opposite, with deporting people and putting them in prison and so on, discrimination,
over and
racism.
over again, it says in the Torah that we should be kind to the alien and be welcoming to the alien because we were once aliens in the land of Egypt. It says that over and over. We were once slaves. We know what it's like.
And the Christian message, the New Testament, is that a continuation of that message from the Hebrew Bible?
Absolutely.
Okay, so
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet, again, there's splits within Judaism, within Christianity, within all the major belief systems. So that, how do you explain that? And how do you tackle that? Because this is not just about American religious life, although we're talking mainly about that, right?
Well, the left hasn't been, left has gone off the rails a little bit in response to the oppressive elements of the Bible, right? And I think what the left has done, especially since the 60s and 70s, is said, because there's bad stuff in here, we're going to throw the whole thing out, and we're going to reject even the notion of being commanded, right? The idea of commandedness. And the left became very individualistic, and it's sort of, we've ended up where we are today with the selfie-taking, me generation, where there is the narcissism and the sense that there is no higher or deeper authority.
It's all relative.
It's the self. Everything's relative.
Everything's relative.
And the self is sovereign, right? And so we've gone off the deep end. I'm saying sort of the progressive movements have gone off the deep end in the other direction, with no anchor, with no accountability to anything, right? With no real accountability to anyone in an ultimate sense, right? The individual gets put before the community. There's a story that I always think about, and I have it in the book, of I was doing a sort of exercise with a group of religious liberals and asking them to imagine their own religious community, but really, really religious, a really observant, really religious version of their own religious community. What would that look like? What kinds of foods would they eat? What would be prohibited? What would they do? What would they not do? And the people just stared at me, and they said, "Well,
what difference does it make,
right? each thing." They said, "Well, there's nothing would be prohibited.
Right.
Nothing would be required, and nothing would be prohibited." And so I pressed them on this a little bit, and like nothing, like no foods, for example, would be prohibited, even if they were made by exploited workers, even if they caused, suffering to animals, even if they accelerate climate change. Really? Like you wouldn't, in your ideal religious community, you wouldn't prohibit any foods like that? And this group of religious liberals who value all those things said, well, we probably wouldn't want to eat those kinds of foods, but no, they wouldn't be prohibited.
Really? So others could make the choice, and that would be okay
the
with
individual, to the value that they placed on the freedom of individuals to make that choice was a higher value than what they decided to do with that freedom.
So they bought sort of the capitalistic mindset.
Exactly.
Moving up the ladder and getting whatever you can. And
so I think that has spiritually impoverished the left. And I think that's part of, you asked about kind of how has this kind of breaking apart, between the religious right and left happened. I think that's part of it.
But the right has embraced it, the greed, if you will, but doesn't call it that.
Right.
Right?
That's
And so rationalizes what they're doing, what needs to be done.
Well, neither the right nor the left recognize the gods that they actually serve.
That's a great way of putting it.
Right.
Right.
And I'm trying to advocate for people you're always going to serve a God. There's always going to be something that you are looking to make your life complete, beyond yourself, something that you're willing to sacrifice for, something that you orient your life around. There's always going to be something, and it's either going to be, buying the next fancy car, or it's going to be something else. But there's always, the throne is never empty. And so I'm saying, why not intentionally embrace a vision of God, or don't use the word God if you don't like it, but a vision of ultimate reality that says, I'm the force that makes transformation possible. I'm the force that liberates, that brought us out of Egypt, that liberates us. Have no other gods but that, and have that guide you, right?
And liberates the individual, at the same time creates liberating structures.
Yes.
Dealing with racism and poverty and
absolutely
mass incarceration and so on.
Absolutely. So that's the beauty of it, as I see it. That if you keep commandments, if you keep sort of an orientation and alignment with that force of transformation, not only do you personally and spiritually get liberated from your, hunger for the next Facebook like, but you also have a clarity to see how you can participate in systems, in healthier systems, and how you can resist the systems of our world that are causing the poverty, that are causing the environmental destruction. And if everybody did that, if everybody had, instead of their consumer objects as their God, if they had this God of liberation, capitalism as we know it would collapse.
And as our colleague and friend would say, as he wrote his book, Michael Lerner, the search for meaning. The endless search for meaning, and what we need to realize is that it is spiritual, and we have to raise our consciousness. So the way you put it here, section on creating religious countercultural space. To create religious countercultural space requires first and foremost that we distance ourselves from the culture of coveting.
Yeah.
So to realize that what we are participating in is really dysfunctional and toxic,
Yeah.
and yet we've been conditioned to want it and to desire it, and that becomes the be-all and end-all. That's a hard transition to make for
Yes.
most of us, right? But you
Absolutely.
do offer some very, very concrete practices, which I really love here. So the following are examples of practices for creating such space for ourselves. And just read a few of these. Recognize all entertainment as cultural entertainment, educating us as to who we are, who we should be, and what we should covet. Sort of like the opening I was giving. Titrate the onslaught of media images and information. Get rid of television, especially in households with children, which you've done. Right?
Indeed.
Okay, indeed. Limit now, okay, and very concrete, basic stuff here that our audience and gets a chance to deal with here. Limit music and movies to those that critique cultural norms and skip those that traffic and celebrate and reinforce cultural norms. Limit our news intake to basic information and critical analysis, opting out of the titillating dramas and vapid sensationalism. Cornel West sounds like. Use social media and browse the internet with restraint, knowing that the culture of coveting also permeates these spaces. Keep a joyful, no exception Shabbat each week, preferably with family and friends. Avoid browsing in malls or department stores. But those malls are going anyway, right? Now everybody's
It's just online, right?
Online, okay.
Yeah.
So you can't, okay, so that's taken care of then. We don't have to browse. Okay. With all their sparkling, enticingly displayed products, there's still there's enough malls still there, right? I'm sure. Okay. Remember that teams of psychologists, marketing experts, and game theorists have spent decades designing these spaces to stimulate coveting.
Yeah.
And it goes on. I mean, these are great suggestions.
Yeah. That's the thing is, I think that we need to do something pretty extreme to be able to give ourselves some space from the gods that we normally have in our culture. Because they have been intentionally designed by teams of experts to be really appealing. Not only the objects, the actual products, but the whole lifestyle of the way that we live and what's considered normal in our day. It's all marketed to us in everywhere we turn. And so when people, liberals tend to sort of grasp this intellectually and to say that they don't like it, and they may even say that they don't buy into it, but we do. And the small efforts that we make to give ourselves some distance, a gratitude journal, adult coloring books, right? The sort of spiritual practices that aren't really grounded in anything sort of deep aren't gonna cut it. They're not gonna give us that freedom from the gods of our modern secular culture. So I think that we need to invest in religious communities.
And community is the big word there too. We can't do this alone.
You cannot do it alone. Absolutely not.
Right. It's
Absolutely
community.
not.
And it's movements. It's about changing people's attitudes individually and collectively through social movements.
Absolutely.
Because that's these periods when that occurs are the times that really radical change can happen. Or
Absolutely. Yeah. Culture change is the entire name of the game. Right.
Now we've tried that and still trying it, but counterculture of the 60s.
Yeah.
Make love, not war. We're going to show a couple of clips at the end. We're going to end with the age of Aquarius and hair, and
Nice.
and we're going to play George Harrison, My Sweet Lord, and Hare Krishna. Now, what happened to those? A lot of them got co-opted. A lot of
They did.
And I noticed that a couple of Malcolm X's daughters now have a line of clothing that actually I've invited them on the show, and but revolutionary
Yeah.
line of clothing that they're going to get people to buy, and then
So how did that happen? Right? That's the
yeah,
that's the question.
okay.
I mean,
yeah.
I'm not a,
Is
I'm
it
not a
possible to ever-
historian,
yeah,
but
yeah, go ahead.
I'm not a
Yeah.
historian, but
Right.
my guess on that is that that countercultural movement, it was such a beautiful thing, and I often feel like I was born in the wrong generation, because that was very much like my heart is with that sort of way of looking at the world. But it wasn't it was like a plant with shallow roots. It wasn't
Yeah.
grounded in deep traditions, and I think that it really could have been. I think that Christian traditions and Jewish traditions and other religious traditions could have given some real gravitas and grounding and accountability to those movements. But instead, it was very much the beginning of what we were talking about earlier, the kind of the self is sovereign. If it feels good, do it. It was this very kind of individualistic, and everything's, if I'm okay, you're okay, and this kind of moral, cultural relativism, right?
Right.
And so it didn't have any real staying power, because it wasn't rooted deeply, and people weren't accountable to something larger than themselves.
And to a certain extent fueled by drugs, sex, drugs, rock and roll. There were serious efforts also to look structurally, but again, it became very much of a me thing, and narcissism, and to a considerable extent what we're having now, but not countercultural. So how to build a counterculture that's not rooted in this sort of selfishness, if you will?
Can I say one more thing about the 60s and 70s movements? There was, I think, a resistance. People were rebelling so strenuously against the kind of hierarchical systems that they were encountering in the government and the military and in just society in general, that they tried to believe that there was that they didn't have any hierarchy, that this was a completely sort of horizontal, democratic, new world that they were creating. But that was almost never true. And I read recently about one example of this, of Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters.
Yes.
Right? They wanted to believe that there was nobody in charge. Right? There was nobody in charge. It was just a kind of self-regulating system where everybody was contributing, and it had this flow to it. But Ken Kesey bankrolled all of it with the money that he made from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And he was the one who was deciding. Which was a serious
attempt to politically transform the institutionalization of mental patients.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
He's great. I have no issue with him. But it was his vision that was invisibly informing what was going on.
Interesting.
And he would create sort of these mechanisms for people, like there'd be games and sort of random lottery systems, tea leaf reading things that would allow different people to make decisions at different times. And that sort of helped to conceal the fact that he was actually in charge. But people wanted to believe that nobody was in charge, right? And so when you don't acknowledge what's in charge, it's back to the throne is never empty. Like something or somebody is always actually in charge, and you're better off knowing what that is and deciding what that is instead of pretending that it's not there.
Absolutely. We've had Todd Gitlin on a couple times in the show, who's the second president, I think, of SDS, Students for Democratic Society. We hope to have Mark Rudd here too as well. The Columbia Rebellion is 50 years old this year, and the discussion was also very much like this. Nobody wanted to be the president. There was such a of SDS. No, please don't elect me. We don't want it. We don't want this fun. Participatory democracy, no control, no power. But there is always someone in control. It's a matter of who is going to do that and which set of values and ethics are we going to follow. The corporate elites, a vicious, aggressive, violent worldview based on fear, racism, hatred of the other, or this tried and true
but reinterpreted.
Yes. In a necessary way.
Yes.
To give us a chance at creating this in a more solid way than was attempted certainly in the country in the 60s. So you have some hope on this, optimism that people are still yearning and looking for this in Trump's America as we get more and more into a neo-fascist corporate militaristic mindset.
I think people are.
Yeah, I do.
I think people are. I think that
Third
progressives-
parties, independent politics. Sorry, and
Yeah.
young people are very open. The idea of socialism. Majority of young people would certainly entertain that.
Yeah.
Something different, an alternative, because this ain't working.
Right.
Dysfunctional and toxic.
Absolutely. I agree.
So we have a minute or so left, and it's been great to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to talk with you.
I encourage all our audience here to pick up this book, just published, just coming out, right?
Yep.
This month, No
Yep.
Other Gods, The Politics of 10 Commandments. And we thank you so very, very much again for adding to this show an enormously profound and important dimension that's desperately needed.
Thank
Anna,
you.
thank you so very, very much.
Thank you so much. It's
And
great to talk with you.
It's great to talk with you, and we'll have you get back and talk more.
All right.
So we will be back next week. This is Jim Vredos, your host on The Radical Imagination, and we're going to go out with an excerpt from Hair, The Age of Aquarius. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on The Radical Imagination.
When the moon is in the